Thank you very much, Secretary Blank, for that fabulous, fabulous discussion on trade. We all, I think, understand we are well served to have Rebecca Blank in the Department of Commerce. Yes? Another applause. All right, now I'm going to introduce someone who is a friend to every exporter in this state. Actually, I don't need to qualify that. He's a friend of everybody in this state. We're all friends of Lew. Lew Cramer, CEO and President of the World Trade Center of Utah.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you very much for coming. What a crowd. What international capabilities we see here. Thank you so much for being part of this economic and export miracle that's taking place in Utah. Our distinguished guests have heard a lot about this export growth and the incredible record of doubling exports the last 5 years. Well, the fun's just begun. The next 5 years are going to be even greater as we go forward. And the important part of this is it creates jobs for Utah. Utah exports mean Utah jobs, higher paying, higher skilled, longer lasting jobs. And that's the reason we're doing this. And we're honored today, World Trade Center in particular is honored to host Bret Stephens, Deputy Editor of the Wall Street Journal. This is a very simple introduction. I will keep it very direct. Bret is the best foreign affairs columnist on the planet. That makes it very easy to look forward to what we're having. No pressure on you, Bret, of course, but this is the reality. As he writes in the Wall Street Journal, in a world that's increasingly, every day, Utah, for example, the foreign policy determines our gas prices, our mortgage rates, what our environment's going to be like. And in that bold world, Bret is even a bolder writer and thinker of the international impact of the world on us. For example, just the last month's columns, I've just picked a couple headlines. One was, Israel will never have peace. Bret has lived, he was the young editor of the Jerusalem Post at age 28, so he knows wherever he speaks in the Middle East. Next column last week was great. Henry Kissinger on China, or not. Very, very provocative article. Then earlier this month, Damascus needs regime change. Bret has been in the middle, reported from all over the world. In fact, sometimes I think if you look at his plane itinerary, that's where the next hotspot's going to be, just because of the impact he has on what's happening. We will have the opportunity for questions and answers when Bret is done speaking, so we urge you to fill out your forms and make those available as well. And in this world, it is critical to have precise, thoughtful, and vivid thinking and writing. Bret Stephens provides that. His bio reflects that he's met world leaders all over the planet. He's interviewed for example, every Israeli prime minister since Shimon Peres. He has been active in ensuring that the world gets a better view, a better perspective, and a better understanding of what makes this world what it is today. Please welcome Bret Stephens.
Well, Lew, thank you for those, I think, overly generous remarks. But it's a great pleasure to be here in Salt Lake City, to be out west for a change as opposed to my usual ambit, which is somewhere between Morocco and Pakistan. The subject of my remarks today are the events that are or seem to be shaping and reshaping the politics and societies of the Middle East. And I think all of us in this room have looked on in astonishment, often with hope, sometimes in fear, as massive popular demonstrations have toppled pro-American dictators in Tunisia and Egypt, threatened anti-American dictators in Libya and Syria, shaken the tiny but strategically hugely important kingdom of Bahrain, and brought Yemen to the brink of chaos and collapse. And who knows where we might go from here. That is one question before us. So too is the question of how the U.S. can help shape events in the region in a way that advances our interests and also reflects our values, understanding that those two goals might not always be aligned or compatible. But before we look at the future, we need to better understand what's going on in the present, which requires us to reflect a little bit about what has happened in the past. So I want all of you in this room to turn or cast your mind back to the very dim recesses of Levantine history, by which I mean go all the way back to the early months of 2005. Now, you'll remember that in January of 2005, President Bush gave his second inaugural address, which amounted to a ringing endorsement of freedom as the guiding principle of American foreign policy. And the speech came at what seemed to be a unique, historic, and opportune moment. Just days before that inaugural address, Mahmoud Abbas became Yasser Arafat's successor as the president of the Palestinian Palestinian Authority, in elections that were generally seen as free and fair. Several days later, the people of Iraq went to polling places all over the country to vote in their first parliamentary elections, and I'm sure all of you recall those fingers stained in purple and held high. And then just weeks after that, the charismatic Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri and 20 members of his entourage were murdered in a massive car bombing in Beirut, which led to massive demonstrations in the streets of Beirut against Syria's 29-year military occupation. And within weeks, the Syrian army had left the country and allowed it, it seemed, for the first time, to be free of foreign occupiers. Now, during this tumultuous period, a well-known, well-regarded analyst of Middle East affairs traveled through the region, and I'd like to quote some excerpts of what he wrote about the situations that he confronted among the Palestinians and then in Lebanon. Here's the article he wrote about the Palestinian election, which it was called From Strong Man to Good Man. Quote, "One image strikes me as I travel through Palestinian territories. During the Arafat years, the image of the Rais, meaning Arafat himself, was always mounted over the backdrop of the Dome of the Rock. 1,000,000 martyrs to Al-Aqsa, he used to say. Now the banner is of Mr. Abbas, but the backdrop is the rocky countryside of the West Bank. How significant the difference in iconography turns out to be in practice remains to be seen, but it bespeaks the distance already traveled." Now here's what that same analyst wrote a couple months later from Lebanon. Quote, "Wherever I go here, the impression is of a people intent on making up for lost time and determined never again to be dragged down by extremism. It is these Lebanese, and not Hezbollah, who are making the country anew and who are doing so at long last in the absence of fear." Now, I would submit to all of you that those two passages I've just quoted are extremely well written. They're based on extensive reporting, and they amount to a fair assessment of the circumstances at the time. I would also add, with the benefit of hindsight, that they were totally wrong, predictably worthless, and in case you haven't guessed it, I am their author. So what happened? Well, within a year of the Palestinian election that brought Mahmoud Abbas, supposedly a moderate, to power, there was a second election among the Palestinians, which gave Hamas a convincing victory there. 18 months later, Hamas succeeded in taking over the Gaza Strip in a brief and bloody civil war against Fatah. This is after Israeli settlements and settlers had fully withdrawn from the Strip. And 18 months after that little civil war, you had the full-blown war between Israel and Hamas, which led to the death of some 1,300 Palestinians. Today, between Israel and Palestine, you have deadlocked, or in fact non-existent, negotiations, Palestinians threatening to seek to declare a state unilaterally at the United Nations, tension between the government of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Obama administration. As for Lebanon, what happened there was, after the departure of the Syrian army, you had a string of high-profile assassinations of pro-Western, pro-democracy leaders. In the summer of 2006, you had an explosive war between Israel and Hezbollah. In January of 2008, Hezbollah effectively took over the streets of Beirut. And in January of this year, Hezbollah became the de facto ruling party of Lebanon. So it sometimes is a question to me whether we should even call it Lebanon anymore. We might call it Hezbollistan instead. Now, why do I go over this history? I would offer three reasons. Now, the first and most obviously is to question my fitness to be speaking to all of you this morning. The second is to remind you that we have seen false dawns in the Middle East many times before. And the third is to suggest that the sharpest analyst of Middle Eastern affairs in this country is not me, it's not Tom Friedman, it's not the great historian Bernard Lewis, it's the comedian Larry David and his motto, "Curb your enthusiasm." So why is this? Why does the Middle East so routinely disappoint our most hopeful expectations for it? Now, if I were a scholar, an academic, I could give you a whole host of explanations ranging from the patterns of tribal societies to the dogmas of and schisms between religion and religions to the often artificial borders that separate one Middle Eastern state from another. But I'm not an academic or a scholar. I'm an ink-stained wretch of a columnist. So let me offer three different and perhaps somewhat more provocative explanations for what is for this continued source of disappointment. The first one is this. In the Middle East, as in junior high school, nice guys tend to finish last. Now, say what you will about Ben Ali, the dictator, the deposed dictator in Tunisia, or Hosni Mubarak, the deposed dictator of Egypt. Each of them had the grace and the good sense to leave power before inflicting massive casualties on their people. The same, quite obviously, cannot be said of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, or Bashar Assad in Syria, or Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in Iran. These people are prepared to kill, these rulers are prepared to kill an unlimited number of people to hold on to power. And what's happening now actually fits into a broader historical pattern. 80, 90 years ago, it was the relatively moderate Hashemite family that was the prevailing power in what we now call Saudi Arabia. They fell to the much more extreme, much more militant, in many ways much more dangerous House of Saud. In the early 1950s, Egypt was ruled by this fat, feckless, corrupt, but essentially benign and tolerant king named Farouk, and he fell to the hard men of the Free Officers Movement, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who proceeded to unleash wars throughout the Middle East. In the few years after that, you had a fairly moderate king in Iraq, pro-American, King Faisal. He in turn fell to the Ba'athist Party, which eventually gave us Saddam Hussein. And in Libya, you had a benign monarch named King Idris, also pro-American. Some people remember that we used to have a U.S. Air Force base in Libya, and he was toppled by the, at the time, 27 or 28-year-old boy wonder of the Middle East, Muammar Gaddafi. So the upshot of this history, and it's repeating itself now, is that in moments of widespread political upheaval, it's the moderates who fail, while it's the thugs who manage to hang on and consolidate their grip on power. Now, the second point, which I don't think receives sufficient attention in the West, in the United States, is the issue of demography. Now, in the West, the problem that we generally confront is that of aging populations, and we can all see the huge stress that aging populations put on our entitlement states. In the Middle East, the problem is precisely the opposite. Consider a typical Arab city, Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. In 1980, Sana'a was a sleepy town of about 200,000 people. Today, just 30 years later, it is an overcrowded metropolis of 2 million people, not that services have improved in the slightest in Sana'a. And that's a pattern you see replicated everywhere else you go in the Middle East. In Lebanon and Tunisia, fully 42% of the population is under the age of 25, born 1985 or after. In Libya and Morocco, that figure is 47%. In Saudi Arabia, 50%. In Egypt, 52%. And in the Palestinian Authority, particularly Gaza, 65% of the population is under the age of 25. Now, if older societies tend to be more cautious, a little slower, perhaps somewhat wiser, younger societies are just the opposite. They're idealistic but impetuous, susceptible to radical ideas, both good radical ideas like liberalism and democracy, but also bad radical ideas like jihadism and Islamist fundamentalism. They're easily inspired and they're just as easily bored. Young societies also have needs that are difficult for any government, even the most progressive and efficient ones, to accommodate easily. They need education, they need jobs, they need to find spouses, and they need to support families. And they need to find the right balance of opportunity and stability. Now, with a clear exception of Israel and the partial one of Turkey, Middle Eastern countries have been failing their youths for decades in every single respect except one, which is, of course, their ability to produce an ever larger youth cohort. And this goes far to explain why, both why we are witnessing today's wave of demonstrations and uprisings, as well as the reason why many of them are likely to fail. What we have, in a nutshell, is the energy and the courage of the young, but that is shorn of the wisdom, the leadership, and perhaps the sense of restraint of the old. Now, the final explanation I would offer for the disappointments of the Middle East is what I am not the first to call the closing of the Muslim mind. Although there's a lot of talk today about how a new generation of young Muslims is reaching for new ideas using the digital tools of social media, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, the overpowering impression of any visitor, certainly any journalist who spends time in Cairo or Gaza or Fez or Islamabad, is how accepted and commonplace totally lunatic ideas, conspiracy theories, and self-contradicting notions have become in these parts of the world, and not just with poor people or religious fanatics, but among supposedly educated and secular and upwardly mobile folks. 9/11 denialism, or I guess what we would call the truther concept, is ubiquitous throughout the Middle East. So is a form of Jew hatred, of open Jew hatred, which hasn't existed in the West since the fall of the Nazi regime in 1945. Let me offer just a few examples which would seem maybe funny to you if they weren't so disturbing. Last fall, before all of these uprisings, there was a terrible, tragic case of a German tourist in the Egyptian resort of Sharm el-Sheikh who was swimming in the Red Sea when she was attacked and killed by a shark. It's terrible, it's very sad what happened to this woman. The belief in the Egyptian media immediately after that shark attack is that the shark had been sent or engineered somehow by the Israeli Mossad to destroy the Egyptian tourism industry. And I guess this is an idea, if any of you have been to Universal Studios and seen, the shark come up out of, the jaws come up out of the water, maybe that was the inspiration for this view. But it would seem comical, except this was a view that was seriously advanced in in large segments of the Egyptian media. Then a few months after that, there was a terrible suicide attack on a Coptic church in Alexandria, a Coptic Christian church in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. Killed scores of worshipers who were celebrating the New Year. And again, the Egyptian media, not just the segment of it that's dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, but also the so-called secular media in Egypt, immediately postulated that it was impossible that the attack could have been perpetrated by another Muslim. It was surely, again, the work of the Mossad. Now, there were two competing theories here. One was that the suicide bomber himself was Mossad, but the other theory that was offered with some seriousness was that Al-Qaeda was now itself under the operational control of the Jewish state, which was, again, creating chaos in Egypt in order to create sectarian schisms there. And the third case, which is a little more geographically far afield, but I thought was very telling and very tragic, concerns a brilliant Pakistani scientist, late Pakistani scientist by the name of Abdus Salam. The Muslim world has produced, I think, about 8 winners of the Nobel Prize, and 2 of them have been in the sciences. Abdus Salam was the first Muslim winner of a Nobel Prize in science. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately for him, he was a member of a minority Muslim sect called the Ahmadiyya sect, or the Ahmadiyya community. And beginning in the early 1970s, the government of Pakistan started passing invidious ordinances against the Ahmadiyya sect. So Salam was forced to leave his native country. He ultimately became a professor, I think, at Oxford or Cambridge in Britain, won his Nobel Prize. Several years later, he passed away, and his body was returned for burial in Pakistan. And on his headstone, it read something like, "Here lies Abdus Salam, the first Muslim winner of a Nobel Prize in Science." Well, someone in Pakistan took exception to the idea that as an Ahmadiyya, he would be described as a Muslim. So they spray painted out the word Muslim on his headstone. This happened in just the last few months. So the headstone then read, "Here lies Abdus Salam, the first winner of a Nobel Prize in Science," which, as far as I know, is not strictly factually accurate. So Salam's case I mentioned because it's an example of how the habits of sectarian intolerance have really hurt, in a serious way, the intellectual capacities of the Muslim world. And it's not just the discrimination against minority sects like the Ahmadiyya, it's also the Baha'i community in Iran, it's Christian communities, endangered Christian communities throughout the Middle East, Iraq being one obvious example, but Pakistan, Egypt being others. And this tracks, of course, with the expulsion of the Jews from much of the Arab or Muslim world, beginning after the creation of the State of Israel in the late 1940s. And the result is a kind of profound intellectual sterility in which truth is rarely to be found on either side of any given political debate. You know, I'm reminded the Austrian physicist Wolfgang Pauli, when he wanted to reprove or reproach a particularly egregious student, would say to that student, "You're not even wrong." And sometimes you listen to some of the debates taking place in the political life of countries like Egypt, and it's a debate essentially pitting Islamists on one side with communists on the other side. And it makes you very pessimistic about the ability of these societies to achieve a productive, progressive political synthesis that can work for them. Now, these comments, these remarks bring me to a semantic, but I think nonetheless very important question, which is what we should call, what is the shorthand that we should give all of the events that are taking place that are roiling the Middle East today. And the term that everyone seems to have settled on is the Arab Spring, which of course has a joyful, promising connotation. And you can understand why we'd want to call it the Arab Spring. It's in part because revolutions or revolutionary movements are always at their most hopeful in their early stages. So the French Revolution in 1789 begins with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the oath at the tennis court. And it's only about 4 years later that heads are rolling off the guillotine in the Place de la Concorde. Similarly, the Russian Revolution of 1917 didn't begin with the Bolsheviks. It began earlier that year in March with a revolution by a social democrat by the name of Alexander Kerensky, who came in with promising ideals. And of course, he was swept aside by Vladimir Lenin's totalitarians. And Kerensky, somewhat fittingly, I think, spent the rest of his life in Berkeley, California. So you see that this is a pattern that has been around for a very long time. And I should add that any of you who have spent time in a place like Egypt know that there is, in fact, no such thing as a spring in the Arab world. These are 2 seasons in many of these desert countries. There is winter, which then is followed by summer, which is then followed by winter again. So my own view is that we are making a mistake which colors and distorts our thinking by calling this an Arab Spring. I think what we really should be calling this is an Arab revolt. And this is not the first Arab revolt. There was a revolt, if any of you have seen Lawrence of Arabia or read T. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, you know there was a revolt against the Ottoman Empire about 196 or so years ago. Later there were revolts in Iraq, Palestine, and Egypt against the British. Then there were revolts against the various kings, Faisal, Idris, Farouk. And now we're experiencing a revolt against the Arab autocrats. And what's important about the word revolt, in my view, is that it's principally about what it's against, not what it's for. So I think that's an important intellectual distinction or semantic distinction that ought to affect our thinking about what's going on. Now, how then do things stand today, and how can we shape them to some better direction? Well, let's have a look. I don't have an audio visual here, but let's have a look in the map that's in all of our minds. In Tunisia, we have a dictator who is gone, and yet you see tens of thousands of Tunisians who are fleeing the country and trying to get to Europe in scenes that are often reminiscent of efforts to get out of Cuba. Libya has descended into a bloody seesaw of a civil war with no apparent end in sight. Egypt, the most important country in the Arab world and the site of so much Western optimism, is descending into sectarian violence between Muslims and Copts. Its economy is in a shambles. It is suffering through a major crime wave. Its foreign policy has taken a sharp turn against Israel and a sharp turn in favor of repairing its ties to Iran. And the Muslim Brotherhood stands to be the biggest winner in forthcoming parliamentary and perhaps presidential elections. In Yemen, we're at the incipient stages of a complete collapse of the state, so that we may soon have another Somalia on our hands. And unfortunately, Yemen has also become the prime headquarters of al-Qaeda today, replacing what Afghanistan and Pakistan once were. And so al-Qaeda will only be able, or will only profit from that chaos. Palestinians are pressing their claims, as I mentioned, for statehood at the UN, even as Hamas, which remains in control of Gaza, is being brought back into the governing institutions of the country. Lebanon, again, under the effective control of Hezbollah, which is itself a wholly owned subsidiary of Iran. In Syria, the protests continue, and so does the killing by the Assad regime. Turkey, through the considerable cunning and political skills of its Islamist prime minister, Erdogan, is opting out of the orbit of the West and increasingly is bidding to become the new leader, I should say the new old leader of the Muslim world. Iran continues to develop its nuclear capabilities. Latest report by the International Atomic Energy Agency was issued just this week, tells us that Iran has produced an additional 970 kilograms of low-enriched uranium since just last September, and they now possess enough enriched uranium that they could, with further enrichment, build as many as 5 nuclear devices in the next year. Is there a bright spot? Yes, there's one. Currently, the only reasonably stable, reasonably free country in the Muslim Middle East is Iraq. And that's a point, I think, that should comfort Americans after investing so much blood, so much sacrifice, and so much treasure in getting that country right. Now, so what should America do confronted with these sets of challenges? Let me offer 4 simple, I hope relatively commonsensical precepts for American action. Now, first, in diplomacy, as in personal or business finance, you don't throw good money after bad. 11 successive U.S. administrations, from Truman to Obama, have been trying to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. They have only twice met with some success, and in each case, that only happened when you had a far-sighted Arab leader like Anwar Sadat, like the late King Hussein of Jordan, that was willing to bury the hatchet with the Jewish state and choose a better future. Otherwise, it has been an unrelieved record of frustration and failure. And yet, at the same time, it has become such an obsession in the State Department, in US and Western policy circles, that the term Mideast peace has become a shorthand for the Arab-Israeli conflict. Well, peace in the Middle East is important, but we can't simply reduce the region or our interests in it to this one uniquely intractable conflict. As a famous former peace processor, Aaron David Miller, has written, trying to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict has become a religion in the West, and it's one that we need to abandon lest it waste more of our energy and distract us from our core and urgent tasks in the region. Now, my second principle is this: be better to your friends than you are to your enemies. Now, America, the United States, has no shortage of non-democratic, illiberal allies in the world, particularly in the Middle East. Think of the Saudi Arabian human rights record or those of the smaller Gulf states. And it would be good to see these countries move in a more progressive political and cultural direction. And I think that in the middle and the long term, it is essential that they do so. And we can greatly encourage them along that path of gradual but steady reform. But the worst thing that we can do, and I'm afraid this is exactly what we have just done in the case of Egypt, is to drop our friends at the first manifestation of public discontent. That's what Jimmy Carter did with the Shah of Iran, and the result was a disaster for the United States, and above all, a tragedy for the Iranian people. On the other hand, we also need to recognize that regimes like Gaddafi's, like Assad's, like Ahmadinejad's, are enemies, and we ought to do everything that we can to bring them down as swiftly as we can. That means dropping the pretense that we are not going after Muammar Gaddafi personally, when clearly we, or at least NATO, that's exactly what we're doing. It means doing everything we can shy of putting boots on the ground to overthrow the Assad regime in Syria. And above all, it means supporting the Green movement, the pro-democracy movement, the anti-regime movement in Iran in precisely the same productive way that we in the West, from Pope John Paul to Ronald Reagan to Lane Kirkland, the head of the AFL-CIO, did with the Solidarity movement, which ultimately brought down the communist regime in Poland and led to the collapse of the entire Soviet edifice. Now, to put this point that I just made in another way, we ought to bear in mind that in countries where things can get worse, we need to proceed with caution. In countries where things cannot get worse, from our standpoint at least, we need to proceed with haste. Now, the third precept is to remember that what we want in the Middle East isn't so much democracy as it is, in the old-fashioned sense of the word, liberalism. Again, semantics matter. In the US, whenever we speak of democracy, what we mean is liberal democracy, which is to say a culture of tolerance, pluralism, openness, and enterprise that corresponds with the mechanistic aspects of holding elections at regular intervals. Yet history is replete with examples of illiberal democracy. In 1932, in this country, we elected the great liberal Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president. The same year that in a democratic election, Germany elected a not-so-liberal Democrat, Adolf Hitler, a National Socialist, to become the Chancellor and Führer and master of Germany. The same pattern repeated itself in 2006 when, under pressure from the Bush administration, the Palestinians held an election which included Hamas on the ballot, and as we all know, they swept that ballot. So we should not suppose that a democracy in Egypt that may soon bring the Muslim Brotherhood into a position of power or considerable influence will be a boon to the real interests of freedom, to say nothing of the interests of the United States. And we should be saying to Egyptians now, before they have elections, that choosing freely means taking responsibility for the choices they make, and that a choice for the Brotherhood or similar types of parties is not one that the United States will accept lightly or without consequence. Now, my final precept is this. That is, a country that is prepared to take a stone in its right hand to execute a defenseless woman, as Iran routinely does, should not be given a nuclear weapon in its left hand to lob at its defenseless neighbors. That means that we need to be very clear in this season of general revolt, when our focus is elsewhere than Iran. We need to be clear that Iran cannot be allowed to get a nuclear bomb. There is too much talk, I think, that we can live with a nuclear Iran, that we can contain it, that the Iranians are too rational to do much with a bomb other than use it as a form of prestige and deterrence. I think this view is dangerously mistaken. A nuclear Iran will set off an arms race in the most unstable region in the world. It would shatter U.S. credibility in the region. It would tempt Israel into a nuclear first strike if, that is, Iran doesn't try to use its bomb against Israel first. It would embolden all of Iran's nefarious allies in the region, from Hezbollah to Hamas, to the Sadrists in Iraq, to even the Taliban, to make further mischief in their respective countries. And it could serve as the ultimate conduit through which terrorists may someday get a bomb for use against Israel, against Europe, and yes, even a beautiful city like Salt Lake City. So when President Obama says that a nuclear Iran is unacceptable, I hope he doesn't mean it in the same feckless way I do when I tell my 7-year-old daughter that her table manners are, quote, unacceptable. Unacceptable must mean, and must be understood by Iran to mean, that the U.S. will take every step in its power, including military action, to prevent this nightmare from coming to fruition. Ladies and gentlemen, every moment of opportunity is a moment of danger, and just as every moment of danger is a moment of opportunity. There are opportunities for the United States today to advance the cause of freedom and advance the interests of the United States. And our chances of doing so grow if we can also have a clear-eyed perception of the dangers that we confront. If I've dwelt too long on those dangers, it isn't because I'm a pessimist, but because I don't want this country to miss its chances by choosing to pursue a desert mirage. Thank you very much.
Does it work now? Thank you very much, Brett. Excellent comments. We have a time for a couple of questions. And Lew, are you ready for the first question?
This question came, if there were a resolution of the Palestinian issues, would there still be Israeli-Arab tensions in the region?
Well, as you mentioned, I wrote a column that said Israel will never have peace. And the answer is there won't be a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian issues. And if there were, that would still not solve the broader set of conflicts. Israel has a conflict with Hezbollah to its north. It looks like it will have a looming conflict, or may have a conflict once again with Egypt to its south. I didn't mention Jordan, I think, except in passing in this entire speech, because there's so much to cover. But the possibility that we may see major and fundamental upheaval in Jordan is also very real. So I'm not the least bit optimistic that solving the Israeli-Palestinian issue will resolve Israel's problems with the rest of its neighbors. I would add one point to that, which is one thing that we have seen, I think one thing that the events of the last few months have demonstrated is that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is not the central issue in the Middle East. The people in Tunisia are not rising because they're upset about what's happening in Gaza or Ramallah. The people in Tahrir Square weren't concerned, at least immediately, again, with resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issues. That doesn't mean they don't care about it. That doesn't mean they aren't passionate about it. But it's not their central concern. And so if we were to solve miraculously, if I'm wrong, that happens every so often. If I'm wrong, we solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we will still have a world of trouble and problems from Pakistan to Iran to the Arabian Peninsula to the Maghreb. And none of those are going to be addressed in any reasonable way because you have achieved peace on a border that amounts to a tiny line in a huge region of the world.
Thank you. I think you have a question here. It says, in a recent speech on the Middle East, President Obama carefully did not use the word democracy or democratization. I can't even say it. Instead, he used the word reform. You comment on that?
Well, you know, I had a lot to criticize about the portions of that speech which concerned his comments on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I actually thought most of the speech I thought was pretty good. And I think it's right that you shouldn't necessarily call on, speak about democratization, because democratization or democracy, as we understand it, regular elections ought to be not the first part, but the last part of a process of liberalization. Because the last thing we need is a democracy that gives, at least in one election, legitimacy to a party with totalitarian values. I have a friend, a very dear friend in Egypt, he's a young guy, he runs something called the Egyptian Union for Liberal Youth. And one of the things that he's been trying to do is get translations of John Locke, Adam Smith, the Federalist Papers, into Arabic, so that at least some core group of young Egyptians can understand what the basic precepts are of a genuine liberal society. If you're an average Egyptian, what is the West to you? The West is a Sony Game Boy, it's the internet, it's prosperity, it's a rich country, the rich countries to your north. But what a lot of these Egyptians aren't seeing are the deep cultural values from which all of these material manifestations emerge. You need to find a way to start sinking intellectual roots in the Arab world. I talked about what I call the closing of the Muslim mind. How do you start opening the door again? Well, that's a very long process. And if you make democracy the first part of that process, you're going to run the risk of destroying the project that you're out to set into place. So I'm happy that the president did stress the democratic aspect. He's right to talk about reform. It was nice to see. I mean, the headline of the editorial journal wrote about it was Obama's freedom agenda, and we meant that obviously with a reference to President Bush, but we also meant it as a compliment to this president.
What about the comment about the 67 line in Israel?
Well, of course, that it's a mark of a bad speech when what's essentially a sidebar comment or a sidebar to the speech becomes the entire focus of the speech. So I don't think the president did himself favors by joining the two issues. Now, the problem with the 67 lines, you've heard, any of you who followed Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington last week, is, first of all, that the lines are themselves indefensible. If any of you are reasonably fit, you can run the 9 miles from the westernmost point of the West Bank to the shore of the Mediterranean. Secondly, those lines were never an international border. They reflected a military armistice at the end of Israel's War of Independence in 1949. Now, the real problem, though, with the comment wasn't so much the question of where the border is drawn. People do understand that a future Palestinian state should it come into existence, will exist more or less along those lines. And the president did talk about having this line mutually agreed swaps. But the real problem is the nature of the Palestinian state that comes into being behind those things. Most of us don't spend a lot of time obsessing about the 49th parallel. I mean, most of you probably don't even know what I'm talking about. The 49th parallel divides us from Canada. But we're not worried about major Canadian invasion, except maybe of moose, because Canada is a liberal democratic neighbor that shares our values and our democratic system. What we do worry about, what Israel does worry about, is midwifing into existence a Palestinian state that remains committed to its destruction. And so what the president ought to have been focusing on, rather than the issue of territory, is the issue of the Palestinian attitude, first towards its neighbors, and second towards itself. Does this want to be the small country that could, like a Singapore, like a Hong Kong, like maybe other small states that have nonetheless become extraordinarily prosperous and admired throughout the world, or does it want to simply become a spear, the spear point of an eventual assault on a Jewish state that it refuses, whose right to exist it refuses to recognize?
Another question. You spoke of Egypt. What is the future of the Coptic Christian faith in Egypt? Is there a future?
When I was in Cairo a few weeks ago, I spoke with a number of young Coptic Christians. And again and again, young guys, smart, educated, people who would be the pillars of the Coptic Christian community going forward, what are they saying? They're saying, can I get a visa to Australia? Can I get a visa to Canada? Maybe I can get a visa to the United States. They're all thinking about their exit options. And if you look at there used to be a thriving Christian community throughout the Middle East. In Iraq, it's been decimated. Bethlehem used to be a Christian town. When I first visited Bethlehem as a kid in 1983, it was essentially a Christian village or town. Now I would say the Christian population of Bethlehem is about 5 or 10%. So there has been a mass exodus of Christians from the Middle East. It is one of the greatest tragedies, cultural tragedies, unfolding right before our eyes. A tragedy for the Christians who have been there for centuries, longer than the Muslims have, and a tragedy also for the Muslims themselves, because these societies have been consistently impoverished, as I mentioned with that anecdote about the Pakistani scientists, impoverished by their intolerance, impoverished by their unwillingness to accept the contributions that people of other faiths can make to the interests of their country and of their culture.
I have a question. That's a given the overall views and the growth of Asia and Asia and South America, what do you think the overall future of Europe is, given the Muslim incursion and the other challenges they face economically?
Look, Europe faces a problem with its burgeoning Muslim community, which isn't simply a problem of what that community represents, values it represents. Europe, unlike the United States, never really discovered or developed an assimilation culture. So, here in America, we've integrated all kinds of cultures and communities, including a large and generally thriving Muslim community in this country, without too much of a problem. Why? Because we do assimilation well. We know how it works, with some exceptions, but we do it well. We have a growing economy, and people come to America because they want to make new and better lives for themselves. Europe has not adopted that model. Instead, Europe has essentially shunted its Muslim populations into these ghettos, either urban ghettos or on the edges of cities, said, you guys do what you want, we don't have any expectations for you to assimilate, and then you have the kind of social problems that you see developing, ban on burqa, these sorts of issues. I don't think that's Europe's fundamental problem. Europe's fundamental problem is that it is 15 years ahead of us in terms of where the welfare state is going. The riots that you see in Athens, the riots that we'll soon be seeing in Lisbon and elsewhere, that is the result of a 60-year experiment in a fundamentally unaffordable version of social democracy matched with very low birth rates. And unless the United States does not want to go in Europe's direction, if we want to maintain our vitality, we want to take inspiration from the growth rates that we're seeing in at least parts of Asia, we need to think very carefully about what it means to be General Motors on a national scale. We cannot be a country that is all about paying defined pension benefits at every level, and not a country that is about innovation, growth, enterprise, risk-taking. So I look at Europe as a cautionary tale. It's up there. For many years people thought America is the land of the future. And wherever we're going, people will soon be where we were or where we are. Well, today I fear that Europe may be our land of the future. And so that is, when I think of the array of challenges that confront the United States, they're all serious. I talked about the nuclear Iran, the upheavals in the Middle East, the genuine challenge posed by an autocratic but strong and growing China. To me, that is the core issue. Look, do yourselves a favor. It's a small country, but it was the birthplace of democracy. It might be the resting place of democracy. Look at Greece and consider whether that's a place that we want to go as a country.
All right, thank you very much. Lew and I are big fans of Brett and read his column every Tuesday, and I could spend all day here and ask a lot of questions. I wanted to ask, is there a China Spring? But we'll get to that another time. Brett, thank you very much. Thank you. We're going to have a 15-minute break and then come back here and continue the program. Thank you very much, Brett.